G'day, dear viewers. Thank you for joining us once again. Ross and Jono with you. And last week, we left the, we were talking about the Moabitica affair, weren't we, Ross? The Moabitica scandal. And that landed us in the year 1878. And in 1878, as we finished the program last week, Moses Shapira had penned a transcription of the 16 leather strips, the contents therein, as best he could, and sent it to a scholar by the name of Schlottmann. That's the way that we ended it. Something else happened in 1878, and that was Julius Wellhausen edited the 4th edition of Introduction to the Old Testament by a German scholar by the name of Frederick Bleek. How do these two events fit together? That's what we're going to be talking about today, but we are going to be starting with the Schlottmann reply. Shall we begin there with the Schlottmann reply to Moses Shapira, Ross?
Yeah, I tell you, this is going to be so much fun and so informative because so much hinges on this period of time. You just ticked off several key names in the story. Not only, obviously, Shapira, but Schlottmann. You talked about Wellhausen. You talked about all of these different events that are rolling around. What is Wellhausen doing with Bleek's document? Who is Bleek? All of these things are really important. But when I first started doing this research for the Shapira affair, I discovered that Shapira mentioned on numerous occasions that once he had the full manuscript in 1878, by the way, we're going to unpack this. I know you'll have questions about this piece of it for the viewers, but in 1878 is when he comes to acquire these 16 pieces. Now, what he wants to do, he becomes convinced almost immediately of their authenticity for reasons that have to be broken down and talked about. But he's almost immediately convinced he's never seen a manuscript like this, and he knows manuscripts, so he wants to get it into the hands of capable scholars. He reaches out in writing to Konstantin Schlottmann, who is a professor, a linguist, who works at the University of Halle. He's a German scholar, and he sends him a letter. Now, I have not seen this letter, but I know at least some of the contents of it because of Shapira's discussions in other letters. He says, I wrote to Schlottmann and I told him about the manuscript, how I had acquired it, the features of it, how I felt that it was authentic. But what we do have, Jono, and I didn't have it at the time that I wrote the Moses Scroll, we have Schlottmann's reply. And this is one of the things I want to talk about tonight. So one of the things that, and I'm just going to say one more thing. As I said, when I wrote the book, I didn't have Schlottmann's reply, but here's what I knew. Shapira said in numerous letters, for instance, his letter to Strock, May the 9th, 1883, he says, I sent a transcription of this manuscript to Konstantin Schlottmann. And Schlottmann, one of the things that Schlottmann said was, how dare you, this is according to Shapira's recollection, how dare you claim that you have a copy of the Torah, basically, that's more original than our 10 Commandments? How dare you? And what I found out as I was working on the Moses Scroll is that when he sent, this is October of 1878, when Schlottmann sends the response to Shapira, he has one other German scholar right there at his desk with him who also looks at the transcription, and his name is Franz Delitzsch. Franz Delitzsch is well known. A lot of Hebrew scholars and students know about Franz Delitzsch. But these two guys, Schlottmann and Delitzsch, are very much evangelical fundamentalists. Now, let's talk about that letter. You got questions already or comments? I know you know the story too.
I just want to say that for those who are following with the textbook, of course, we're talking about the Moses Scroll, Ross's book, The Moses Scroll. Excellent book. If you don't have it, you can get it on Kindle. We're going to be talking about some other publications that you have available. We'll get onto that a little bit later. But Kindle, paperback, hardcover, and now audiobook is the latest format. If you don't want to read it, or if you want to read it with the someone reading it along with you, if that makes it easier, you can absolutely do that. But we are in chapter 4, and this is what's going on, just to bring people up to speed on how we arrived where we are. The Moabitica scandal, of course, after the discovery of the Mesha Stela, the Moabite stone, there was a rush to get relics from Moab, something authentic that you could buy or take home or put in a museum. It turns out that Schlottmann wanted to get all of this for Germany, get it all for the museum there, and he bought, what was it, 1,700 pieces or something?
1,700 pieces. That's right.
1,700, and it wasn't cheap. It was something well over, in today's money, $400,000 I think you said, with which he may have purchased Tico House. Shapira did, and moved in there. And we've been there, and we have seen some of that Moabitica. But there was some question as to the authenticity of all of it. Like, there were, even Shapira himself said, "I'm not so sure. You're the expert. You have to authenticate this before you buy it." And Schlottmann's like, "Give it to me. We love it. We want it all." And then enters Clermont Ganneau, who says, "Ha ha 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 ha. It's fake." And there's egg on Schlottmann's face. In any case, Shapira acquires these strips. He's quite convinced of them. He writes a transcript, sends it to Schlottmann, and this is the letter that he receives back. So it's probably the rejection is probably fueled a little bit by that egg on face.
I think the same thing. And in fact, if I can jump in 1 second, just because we have the dates, this was a very painful rejection that we'll talk about, Jono, because as you mentioned, Shapira really was shamed in some way, because even though a lot of people didn't, they all believed that the whole Moabitica were fake by this point. But actually, by 1874 to 1876, hammer after hammer fell until ultimately the Germans reluctantly admitted that they felt like the whole thing was a sham. Now, Shapira was not implicated in the manufacturing of that. Most people said he was a dupe, but Shapira had one scholar who continually maintained the authenticity of the Moabitica, and that was Constantine Schlottmann. To everything that I have read, up until the time that he died, he believed that the majority of the Moabitica were authentic.
Really? I didn't know that. Up until the time that he died? Really?
That's right. Yeah.
That is very interesting. So tell me then, with that in mind, what do you think was the motivation for the letter that you're about to unpack for us in the response to Shapira writing to him with about the 16 leather strips? Because is it because Derlich is there and he's like, how dare you even suggest that there's something more original and that it doesn't agree with our canonical text? I mean, write back and tell him, to go jump in the lake. Is it that, or is it we don't want anything further to do with anything that comes from Moab and Shapira? That's too. So what do you think is the primary?
I tell you,
motivation?
know more now. I know more now than I did when I wrote the Moses Scroll. And here's one of the things that I know. First of all, let me hit one point. Shapira is writing to, in what I'm about to read you, just a little snippet. When he's writing to Hermann Strack on the 9th of May, 1883, he says, "I have sent a transcription of the most of it," talking about the manuscript strips, "to Professor Schlottmann on 24 September, 1878, asking him his opinion, to which I got only a rebuke saying, 'How I dare call this forgery the Old Testament? Could I suppose for 1 minute that it's older than our unquestionable genuine 10 Commandments?'" And then one other thing, he goes on, Shapira is telling Strack, that Schlottmann went on to say it's not genuine. He can prove it contradicts the Bible. It uses Elohim instead of Jehovah. And then he went into other details of why it wasn't known. So when I wrote the Moses Scroll, I thought that the main reason, and perhaps one of the only reasons that Schlottmann responded the way he did in a rebuking letter to Shapira, was that he was fundamentalist. He may have had some egg on his face from the shame of the Moabitica thing, because remember, Schlottmann, as you mentioned a few minutes ago, he encouraged, and it was his academic level within the government, and people in Germany knew him so well that the Germans actually bought the Moabitica. So he had all of this kind of work in it. But here's what I know now. We now have the letter that Schlottmann wrote to Shapira. Idan Dershowitz found this and sent me the letter. And I'm just going to read the opening part because I think it tells us what Schlottmann was going through. This is brand new. I don't know of any English speaker in the world that knows this. At the top of the letter, it says, Herr Shapira, this is translated, bookseller and antiquarian in Jerusalem, Halle, October 17, 1878. This is the letter. He says, I must not conceal from you that you make it increasingly precarious and difficult matter for those who have publicly stepped forward in defense of your honest name. So he's telling him, Shapira, you are making it hard to be your friend. I think he's literally torn over this. He continues, you once dated the something inscription to the time of Moses. That was forgivable, as epigraphy was entirely unfamiliar to you until then. So he's referring to an event where Shapira dates something to the time of Moses, and that was later disproven. So then he gets into, you could not be faulted for voicing such a notion. Worse was that after that, later, so many experiences, you couldn't for a moment consider possible that the known clumsily forged lead inscription originating from Samson's tomb. I know about this story too. So he's ticking off. Schlottmann has a list of grievances. He says, I have stood by your honest name, and here are some things that are making it more difficult. You did this. You dated this inscription to the time of Moses. It was proven to be later. You said that this lead inscription on this casket cover was from Samson's time. You said, and he's going through, he lists 4 things. And he says, even worse than that, after showing me the forgery with significant import, and I had immediately expressed my disappointment against my advice, and then there are a couple of words we can't read, you still took it to England. He's still talking about this casket thing, and showed it there. I believe you readily that you didn't declare it genuine, but as an honorable man, you should have been ashamed to show it to anyone there at all. So he's talking down to Shapira, and then he's basically saying, and now, on the heels of all of that, I have this manuscript. Now, let me tell you why you should have noticed it was a forgery, and he begins to tick off his reasons as to why. So now, and one thing, and then I'll relax for a minute and let you fire off some questions. It seems like he loves Shapira. And by the way, Delitzsch does as well, because we have a series of articles where Delitzsch can be critical of the Shapira manuscript, but defend his name and his honor. These guys like him, but they're saying it is becoming more and more difficult for us to stand up for you because these negative press pieces are really stacking up. And it gets to the point where, you know, I mean, people are actually associating us with your bad judgment. All right, so that's kind of a little bit of an insight there.
I have to ask the question because I seem to recall you've mentioned this to me before, but I need you to refresh my memory, and I imagine that the viewers are hoping you'll do the same. The lead inscription from Samson's tomb. Can you tell us anything more about that?
Yeah, what I can do is it was, as I understand it, it was like a lid to a coffin, a lead
to a
coffin.
Sarcophagus type or like a bone box type.
Yeah, and it was inscribed with the name of Samson, and so the story is a bit confusing. Of course, the detractors, those who talk badly about Shapira, say he pitched it off as something positive. And by the way, there are quite a few of these lead caskets that they have found in the Levant. So this is not a big deal. This was
later?
It's not that
or earlier.
Later, yeah, not to the time of Moses, or not to the time of Samson, but later.
Yeah.
And so what we do have is we do have accounts where he brings this to England to pass it off, to sell it. And of course, it's got the name of Samson on it. So some stories say that he then associated it with the time of Samson. And look, okay, he's a salesman.
I see.
Maybe he did,
right?
But ultimately, even in Schlottmann's letter here, he says, "I realize and I've heard that you did not suggest that it goes back to that time, but I still don't think you should have brought it, to the English because so many people are still hung up on the Moabitica." Is basically what he's saying.
Right.
So he's got two views. One, I think he loves Shapira, or he considers him a friend, and he doesn't want him to make a buffoon of himself, a fool of himself. And it maybe even more importantly, I'm sticking my neck out for you, Shapira, and you just keep stepping on me, and I'm tired of it, and you better straighten up. So
here he comes with 16 leather strips that are it's a document claiming to be older than the texts that we have in our Bibles, and there are significant variations there, and it's just too much for Schlottmann to carry.
That's right.
He's not about to try and sell this. Okay.
Yeah, and so a couple of other things. So we build out the narrative of what's going on as we read through the letter of Schlottmann. Remember, we discovered in the research during the writing of the book that at the time that Schlottmann sends the reply, the 17th, remember it's sent on the 24th of September, and on the 17th of October, he gets a reply. I mean, this has got to go to Germany. It's got to be read. It's got to be replied, and
that's quick.
Now I'm dealing with the post office here in modern days. I ordered a copy of my own book, and I can't even get it. So I can imagine it would have been, I don't know, maybe their postal service was better than mine. But anyway,
evidently,
that's beside the point. But so Schlottmann and Delitzsch were working on a new Bible translation for a Lutheran Bible at the time in 1878. And they were at Halle University together when the letter comes in with the transcription. So they jointly write a reply. Now, here's something that a lot of people may not know. Schlottmann and Delitzsch were very, very big in the evangelical church. And so much so, they were also involved in the salvation of the Jews. They both belonged to a organization and were founding members of organizations at the time that were geared on bringing Jews to Jesus. So they're very fundamentalist. And so one of their biggest problems is, Shapira, you're supposed to be an honest Christian man like us. And how do you fall for this? Huh?
Yeah. Toe the line. We have an approved text. We're working on a new translation. If we're to consider anything outside of that box, then it dismantles the project that we're working on right now.
That's right.
Not to mention our careers. We just can't do it. You're asking too much of us, Shapira. Is that the way it comes across?
Yeah, and one of the things that really strikes me and that hit me when I wrote the book and still hits me today one of their biggest problems is the Ten Commandments. Okay, Schlottmann mentions it in his letter. He says, "How dare you say that your manuscript, this old," he calls it an old new manuscript, you know, because he's making fun. It's
Sure.
yeah, it's old, but it's brand new. How dare you suggest that it contains a copy of the Ten Commandments your Moabite missionaries came up with that is older than our genuine Ten Commandments? Now, here's something. Now, then also, Delitzsch says, don't mess with our Ten Commandments. We learned that from one of the Edward Meyer letters. He tells his teacher, he tells George Ebers that old Delitzsch got really upset when it came to messing with his Ten Commandments. But here's what they failed to say, and it's going to come back into our story in a little while. So the problem is that the manuscript of Shapira's strips had a different set of Ten Commandments than the genuine one in our Bible. But Jono, we've done shows on this. What is it about our Ten Commandments in our Bible? What is it? Tell the viewers.
We have done multiple shows on this, and one of the things that really stands out in comparison is that the Ten Commandments, the Decalogue in the Moses Scroll, actually has 10 commandments as opposed to 9, which is what we have in Exodus and Deuteronomy. Not just that, but they are each specifically itemized. They're signed off by Elohim, Ani Elohim, Anochi Elohim Elohecha, and so it's very, very clear. And there is a commandment there that makes number 10, which comes from Leviticus chapter 19. We see that there, or rather Leviticus chapter 19, verse 17, takes that from the Moses Scroll when it's trying to recall the 10 commandments. Clearly there's a number of parallels to be made there, but primarily there's 10. There's not 9, Ross.
Yeah. Now, just so some of our viewers are saying, well, I just found you guys on the internet. I don't know who that could be, but somebody might have just found us. Thank God they did. But they might be saying, what are you guys talking about? There are 10 commandments. I have them on my refrigerator magnet. And I can quote them, and my children learned them in Sunday school. But listen, here's the thing. Let me add one more detail or one more element of complexity. If you take Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5, the two accounts which purportedly give the 10 words spoken by God to an assembled group of Israelites at the foot of Horeb or Sinai, depending on which version you read, and proclaim those 10 words from the midst of fire with an audible voice so that all heard and shook and trembled, but they don't match. They don't match. Now, so much don't they match that the rabbinic tradition had to develop answers for this so that somebody might notice that and say, why don't they match? But what happens is that tradition, church and synagogue tradition, to get 10, had to split either the first word or the 10th word. Now, we're going to get into the details of the text later, but I just wanted to make sure people understand that you're not crazy for making the statement that you just made. But Delitzsch and Schlottmann were very upset that how dare you suggest that some new old text gives a different 10 commandments than the real
gives
10
a different
one.
Two things just to highlight again by way of revision. How many words difference between Deuteronomy and Exodus in the 10 commandments?
You know, I have
Do you recall?
that. I have it written down in the document.
Off the top of my head,
I can't remember the exact, but it's
I think it's something like 180 letters or some such. I forget how many words.
I think it is.
Something like that. It is significant. Yeah.
It is significant.
Well,
some of the differences are minor, but particularly in the Sabbath command, there is a vast difference between the two and so forth. And, people
and so the inevitable
remember,
question is, go ahead, people might remember.
People might remember that in one version it says to guard the Sabbath, and one says it's to remember the Sabbath day. But then one deals with, the Exodus version deals with because of the creation was done in 6 days. whereas Deuteronomy deals with the redemption from Egypt.
Because you were servants.
Anyway.
Yeah,
and
neither
one of
and
those
therefore
are
the inevitable
original.
question arises of how is it possible that these are variations? There's variations in the delivery of the 10 words, and as you pointed out, there is a rabbinic spin to explain that, and really the best that they could do with it, Ross, because a lot of people are asking, well, what is that rabbinic explanation? Is that God spoke both of them at the same time, and that's all you can do with it. You just have to say, well, he spoke both of them at the same time. Sure.
Yeah.
All right, moving on.
All right, now
what does my question is what does Shapira do, Ross? What does he do as a result of this? I mean, he feels like he has stepped on sacred toes, if you like, and he doesn't know what to quite do about it. Has he done something wrong? Has he gone too far? Schlottmann kind of, gives him a little bit of a guilt trip here. What does he do with the document?
I tell you, he does what I did in a way when I first became aware of certain difficulties in the biblical text. I went, even if ever so briefly, I went running back to my fundamentalism, and I grabbed it and I hit my knees and I prayed to God. I called on God and I said, I don't mean to challenge this holy, inspired, inerrant, authoritative word of God. Please forgive me. I mean, that's right. Amen. Hallelujah. And that's what he did, because he felt, I think he felt from those words from his friends, because they basically said, shame, Shapira. You ought to know better. You're supposed to be a model. You're supposed to model the way, and here you are.
You're one of our guys.
And you're our boy, and here you are following these liberal scholars. And you know what? Shapira says when he read the letter, he said he wasn't convinced by any of the evidences in the letter, but because of Schlottmann's call to him to go back to the faith, he said, I wavered. So he takes the manuscript strips because he doesn't want to be a heretic. Look, think about this too. When Shapira came into Jerusalem in 1856, he had converted to Christianity along the way. And so he received harsh, hateful comments from his fellow Jews who called him a traitor, a heretic. You've abandoned the faith of your fathers. And they made fun of him. They called it. So now he's barely lived through that. Probably still takes a brunt of those kind of comments in Jerusalem. Now he's got his newfound faith. They're saying it about him too, and this is where I think I relate to him, because everybody thinks I'm a heretic. So what he does, he decides he's going to put this manuscript in the bank. So he goes to Bergheim Bank in Jerusalem.
Yep.
The Bergheims are not only bankers, but the Bergheim family is very tied in with everything going on in Jerusalem. They're connected with the Germans, the British. Every story that you read about great discoveries in the 19th century, latter part of the 19th century, Bergheim Bank is financing everything. I mean, they're the only name in town, basically. There were a couple of other banks, but they're the big boys. So Bergheim takes these manuscript strips and puts it in a vault, and it's put away after October, sometime in October of 1878, and it stayed there for a while. We'll talk about that in just a few minutes.
It stays there for 5 years, and we're going to get to why it eventually comes out. But people think, okay, so 5 years, he puts it in a bank vault for 5 years. I mean, obviously, he's got his own safe in his shop. He's got his own security there. But this, in his mind, required additional security. In his mind, this is still a very important document. He clearly still believes in it, but
That's right.
But puts it away. In the meantime, Ross, he's distracted with another project. Can we talk about that briefly?
Yeah. I think we hit that high level because we talked about it a little bit in the interim between our last discussion and this one. This one requires a full story, but a full episode. But let me just say, before we actually do that, 1878, fall of 18, he puts it away in the bank. Manuscript strips are safely in the bank vault, Bergheim Bank. 1879, he begins to go through the ancient world at the time. He's making trips to Egypt. He's making trips to Yemen. And this is before the Houthis were a big problem at the time, I guess. But he's circling the globe. He's going into what is now Saudi Arabia. And
let me ask you about that. You're saying that he's going down
documents.
to Yemen, he's going down to Saudi Arabia. How is he getting down there? Are you telling me that he is riding his donkey? Is this how he's getting around?
You know, I don't know if he loads it on a vessel and catches maybe a ship at, I would think, that he would catch a ship at Eilat, you know, at Aqaba, at Eilat, and go down the Gulf of Aqaba to Yemen. I would suppose that's the way you do it at the time.
I guess so.
But some of these journeys, he makes a little side money. He's actually documenting terrain and used instruments. The guy was a genius. And we have records of some of this. He records what the climate was like, what the vegetation that grew along the way. He goes to these different places. I mean, he was going to the Sinai, and he was going to Egypt, searching for documents at like the Cairo Geniza. I mean, before Solomon Schechter was ever a thing, Shapira is in those places making manuscript purchases, ultimately selling them to the Staatsbibliothek, what we now call Staatsbibliothek, the Berlin Museum, and the museum in England. And so he's selling manuscripts. He is known as a purveyor of old manuscripts. And these, to this day, represent some of the oldest and greatest manuscripts that are now in the possession of people like the British Museum. 140 some odd, if I remember right, I know you got into this for a while, I think it was 142 Karaite biblical manuscripts that Shapira brought himself.
Manuscripts, that's right.
So
and I think that's the biggest. Yeah, it's huge. It's
huge.
Quite a treasure, and it's still
massive.
there.
Now, quickly, and we'll talk about this on a show next week. Quickly, in June of 1880, a young Jewish boy stumbles upon the greatest archaeological discovery in the land of Israel when it comes to inscriptions. The greatest inscribed archaeological discovery in Israel, in the land of Israel. And Shapira is on the scene before almost anyone. We know this now. We prove it. We prove it from not only his own personal correspondence, his daughter's letter. We also have evidence from a Russian diary that was written in 1881 that tells the story of Shapira being one of the first. Turns out it's the Siloam inscription, which we'll talk in great length next week. But Shapira is the first in a couple of big deals with the Siloam inscription. And so that carries us through, you know, in 1880, June of 1880, it's discovered. This becomes the talk of the archaeological world up until roughly 1882, and Shapira is right in the middle of this debate and proves to be the hero, the unsung hero of the whole story. And then
he is, and we will go into the details as to why that is the case. But he is quite involved in the whole saga. And you made a presentation in February last year, I think. Was it February last year?
Yep, that's right.
On this topic. Yeah. So anyway,
in fact, it was. I think it was today. I think Patty Tyler or Dave, one of them. I think it was Patty, sent me a note saying, "Hey, it was this time last year. We were in Jerusalem at the Albright Institute, and I presented the subject that we'll talk about next week, and we'll share that video again, so people need to watch that." But it's at this time, Jono, that Shapira reads a book And he says it changed everything. Let's talk a little bit about that book.
All right. So, as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, this particular book was had a fourth edition in 1878. It was originally published in 1860, which is a year after the death, in fact, of Frederick Bleek. In fact, he was, let me have a look here. He was born, get this, Ross, he was born on the 4th of July in 1790.
Good American boy. No, he was German. He was German.
Born on the 4th of July, 1793, until the 27th of February in 1859. But the original publication came out. The first edition was released in 1860, an introduction to the Old Testament. Julius Wellhausen, many people will know his name, edited the fourth edition in 78, but that wasn't the edition that Shapira was reading. He was reading one of the first, I believe, by his own admission. What did he have to say about that book, Ross?
Let me, you just hit on a really great point that I want to touch on just to show you, to show the viewers something. You mentioned Julius Wellhausen. He is known by most who know very little about academic scholarship of the Pentateuch. He's the guy, right? He's the one who gets credit for putting together what is called the documentary hypothesis. We need to do a whole show just on that because it gets a bad rap and people really don't know that much about it, honestly. I hear people talk about it and they assume that it's just some liberal view of people just picking and choosing what verses belong to what source, and it's just really tragic that people don't know more about this subject. But the bottom line is this: whenever Wellhausen, he is the guy, he's learning about this from Bleek and other scholars, Graf, Graf, other brilliant scholars. This theory that we now call the documentary hypothesis developed in stages. It really comes down to identifying sources, of the Pentateuch. And so Bleek was one of the guys, as you mentioned. Wellhausen is editing his work. He gets a lot of his ideas from Bleek. So when Shapira reads Bleek, one of the things that he sees is scholars were beginning to grapple with very difficult questions that fundamentalists dared not ask. Okay? I mean, it just comes down to this idea that Shapira was exposed to something which made him question the criticisms that he had received from people like Schlottmann and Delitzsch. And we'll talk about those. But let me touch on this book that I'm holding. This is a printout. You may have it as well. I know
I have
we worked through it
in front of me
a year and a half ago.
Yeah, I've got it on the computer. I was reading through it again yesterday, and it is amazing how much Bleek quotes other contemporary scholars and previous scholars, by which these theories develop of, as you say, documentary hypothesis, or one might say source criticism, or perhaps we could say author analysis. Can we say that of the Pentateuch? It is a fascinating book, and it is available on the internet. People can find it and give it a read. And bear in mind that this is a significant book in the mind of Moses Shapira as you're reading it, that eventually made him decide that he was going to bring it out of the bank vault. Ross, read to us some of it.
I'll give you a couple of quick high-level deals. Bleek, his work is called in English An Introduction to the Old Testament. Of course, this is what I'm looking at is that it's translated from the second edition, 1865. So there are some improvements. There are some editorial changes from the first edition, but it was in English. It gave me the ability to peer inside what. This was published in 1865, so 5 years after the original German work came out. This is a translation of that second edition. But here are some of the things. By the way, we know what Shapira says is that he became aware that the Torah, the Pentateuch, as we have it, was not written by Moses or about his time. Now, Jono, that's a major deal. If you're a fundamentalist, and people, some of our viewers might be somewhat fundamentalist, they hear me say, wait a minute, you're telling me that the Torah as we have it, the 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, were not written at the time of Moses and by Moses? How in the world? Well, here's what this is about. This is an example from Bleak. I'm just going to open up to the part on the historical 5 books. He says, our investigation, whether and to what extent Moses may have been the author of the Pentateuch, must be conducted quite independently of the customary title of these books. In other words, you open up your Bible and it says, the first book of Moses, called Genesis, the second book of Moses. So he begins by saying, all of that stuff, none of that is in the original text. So where do we get the idea that Moses wrote these 5 books? Remember, in the 5 books, we are introduced to the figure of Moses in Exodus chapter 2. From Exodus chapter 2 until Deuteronomy 34:12, it's pretty much about Moses, his involvement in bringing the children of Israel from Egypt, etc. But the thing that is interesting is that most of that material from Exodus chapter 2 to the end of Deuteronomy is written in the 3rd person. Moses is mentioned nearly 700 times from Exodus 2 to the end of Deuteronomy. Most logically, that assumes, it's 3rd person, it assumes an author other than Moses. Now, we do have, and we're going to get into all this over this series, but we do have a small section of one book that is written in the 1st person by Moses. And it's not Exodus, it's not in Leviticus, it's not in Numbers. So I'll let people guess what it might be. Okay, quickly though, as you go through this, he covers, I mean, mine is marked up in I don't know how many places. It's filled with notes, but it brings up things like the author of the Pentateuch. This is what Shapira would have read. The author of the Pentateuch records the death of Moses. Moses, dead people don't write. That's one thing we know. So it's a safe assumption to assume, and even the rabbis admit this, that Moses would not have written about his own death. Well, how about this one? Deuteronomy chapter 1, the author is on the wrong side of the Jordan. He says, because we know Moses never crossed west of the Jordan, but someone is telling the story, Deuteronomy chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. These are the words which Moses spoke unto the children of Israel on the other side of the Jordan. So fundamentalists try to come up with all kind of wacky answers to that. It just doesn't hold water. Shapira became convinced that Moses didn't write the 5 books as we have them. They were not written by Moses. They were not written about his time, during his time. Another example, Exodus chapter 16. It was just in this past week's Torah portion, or 2 weeks ago. Exodus 16, there's talk about the Sabbath. They hadn't even made it to Sinai yet, or Horeb. And it's talking about not only Sabbath observance, but it says that manna, it gives us a full story about manna. Manna was eaten by the children of Israel, Jono, for the 40 years during the wilderness experience until they crossed into the new land. Well, a person, that's not a contemporary writer. Someone who is alive when the children of Israel, or someone who is along the journey during the wilderness experience, can't say, if it's Moses, he never gets to the other side of the Jordan and saw that the manna stopped. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of examples of these.
Yeah.
And one of the things I did, because Shapira mentions in 3 letters, he says that he became convinced it was not written by Moses or during his time. And what I found in Bleak is example and example after example where Bleak says, this shows that the Torah was not written by Moses or during his time. So Shapira is picking this up. Now, he read the German version. And coming out of that, he had enough reason to say, now, wait a minute. Schlottmann and Delitzsch told me this couldn't be something earlier than our Bible because it just can't be. But he said, now I'm seeing some things. Here's another thing he learned. And we'll talk about this for a moment. That scholars believed at the time, and still do, that the name Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, we say Yahweh or Jehovah or Yehovah, that name was not known in the earliest stages of the Hebrew faith. Now, I know that as early as Genesis chapter 4, we get this verse, and it says, then men began to call upon the name Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. And so people go, oh, there it is, Ross, you're wrong. But what they fail to admit into the judging criteria is that in Exodus chapter 6 and verse 2, it says very clearly, God is speaking to Moses according to this. He's revealed himself in Exodus 3 in one source. Exodus chapter 6, it's another story of his first revelation to Moses. And he says very clearly, by my name, Jehovah, or Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, I was not known to the fathers, but by my name, El Shaddai, in fact. Now, that's fascinating because it immediately makes the reader of that go, well, wait a minute. Abram and Abraham, as he's called later, Isaac, Jacob, Noah, all of these, the name is used from Genesis chapter 2, verse 4, up until Exodus chapter 6, verse 2 and beyond. How is that not a name known to the fathers? What's interesting about this document that Shapira had in his hands, it had an introduction sentence and a closing sentence that he believed was appended by a later scribe. But what's fascinating to him, now having learned that the earliest form of the Torah, according to the scholars, would not have contained the name of God, so too his document read Elohim.
So too his document. So just to repeat what you've said, so the footnote and the endnote, like a library note of this is what you're about to read, when you're finished, this is what you've read, are the only two places where the tetragrammaton is used, the name Jehovah is used. Everything else in between, which is the actual document itself, uses only Elohim, much in the same way as Genesis chapter 1. You mentioned from Genesis chapter 2, verse 4 is using the name Jehovah, but before it's entirely an Elohist document. And so scholars are looking at this going, well, these are two different writers. These have to be, and there's so many examples of that, that and more. And so what eventually develops, Ross, correct me if I'm wrong, but we have an understanding of an Elohist writer, a Yahwist writer, and a priestly writer. The Deuteronomist, eventually a redactor, and finally it is all brought together in the text that we have today. Is that a fair summary?
That's a very good, concise summary, and the theory. Let's call it a theory. Is quite fascinating when you read it. A lot of people, again, who don't really understand it, and I would recommend a couple of books. There, a newer book I have here. It's by Joel S. Baden, The Composition of the Pentateuch. He gives examples. I would say that the single best book on the subject to open people's understanding, to at least expose them to it, is Richard Elliott Friedman, Who Wrote the Bible. And I'll put a link to that book in the description of this video. Now, listen, Jono, this is not a book, it's not trying to prove a fundamentalist view. And I knew about the work and was scared to read it for years because I'd already sort of walked out of a previous faith. And I was a little bit anxious. No, I was very anxious to learn that there might be problems with something else, I believe. But when I
With that which
finally
with you
read it,
refined your faith too. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
yeah, but once I read the book and I understand it, it has ignited within me the greatest of faith and the strongest desire
Yep.
to fight for and find and proclaim and advocate truth above truth above truth.
Yes.
This is fascinating now, and I think you and I both, thank goodness we had one another to work through some of these challenging things. And we want people we want to help people struggle through these as well.
And we were apprehensive. We were very apprehensive. So anyone who is fundamentalist who's listening to this right now going, oh, you boys you've gone too far. We were feeling that as well at the time.
Oh, yeah.
And it's probably how Schlottmann was feeling at the time as well.
Oh,
and
no
no doubt
doubt.
Shapira, having put it in the bank vault for 5 years, but then having read Bleak, emboldened him to take it out of the bank vault and go, you know what? I just really feel like this is an authentic document and it needs to be shown to the world. And what happened? He takes it out and what?
Yeah, he says sometime around Easter of 1883. This is the dating that he gives. He said he had just read Bleak, and he realized, as you said, that, hey, wait a minute. If these scholars are saying the following things about the original Pentateuch, I think I was right all along, because now this document aligns with what scholars are now realizing. In other words, if you ask modern scholars in 1883, hey, what do you think? I know that they would say, let's think critically for a minute, like critical analytical scholars would say in 1883. Someone would say, assuming there was a Moses and he actually wrote a Torah, and it's not the 5 books as we have it, what would it look like? And the scholarship at the time would say, well, it would be an earlier form. It wouldn't be these later anachronistic additions. We'll talk about all these words and phrases in subsequent discussions, but it would be written in first person by Moses. It would probably be an Elohist document that would not use the name Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. It would probably, and he just, listen. So Shapira, having just read Bleak, said, I got it. It's in the Bergheim Bank. So he goes to get this out of the bank. Now, one of the criticisms, I need to say this, one of the criticisms that some people have said is, hold on. Shapira had read Bleak, and he formulated a document to match what Bleak and the scholars were saying at the time. He submitted it to Schlottmann. Schlottmann kicked it back. He put it in a bank. He brought it out again later with having revised it after he learned more. No, that's not. And we'll talk about why that can't be the case. Number one, we know that in 1878, we know basically what was being criticized in the Schlottmann letters. In 1883, when it comes forward, we know what it says, and it has the same things in it. So it's not like as we say, Jono went back to the drawing board. No, he submitted it again, but he said, y'all not going to make me put this thing up again. I'm telling you, this is ancient, it's authentic, and I have become convinced it is as well.
And he really was. And but it's not as if everything in Bleak agreed with Shapira and this particular scroll, Ross.
That's right.
I mean, Shapira becomes convinced that he has an Elohist document, and there's certain things about it by which he is compelled that it is authentic. But the source critical scholars they're kind of flying blind because they don't have the original document. They're trying to speculate on as you were, what it would have looked like. And there were certain aspects of the canonical text that we have today that they believed was very ancient and would have been in the original, which was not in the Shapira scroll, the Moses scroll. What are some of those, for example?
A good example. That's an excellent point, Jono. One of the things is we know from the Shapira manuscript, from what we have as far as transcriptions from the time, We know that it was considered almost immediately then and now to be an early form of the book of Deuteronomy. Now, it's got traces of what we could find in, say, a little bit of Exodus, a little bit of Numbers, but it is void of one section of text that even today, almost universally, I have to qualify, almost universally, scholars would say that the earliest strata of Deuteronomy is Deuteronomy 12 through 26, the law code. And the law code, as it's called in Deuteronomy, 12 through 26, contains what makes Deuteronomy really, really unique to a lot of people. It contains what we would call centralized worship. So if you take, for instance, you take Deuteronomy out of the equation and just look at Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, particularly Exodus, you're going to find that that you can sacrifice. There's no real reason not to sacrifice wherever you feel the desire to sacrifice to God. We see, in other words, we see in the patriarchal narratives, people sacrifice wherever. We see that even up through certain parts of the Pentateuch. But once you get to Deuteronomy, there is a variation on a phrase that says, at the place where the Lord your God will put his name. You know, it's the name place theology. It's called, you know, this idea of location, sanctity, so forth. And so you see that in chapter 12, in chapter 17 of Deuteronomy in particular. There's some other elements. The monarchy in chapter 17, verses 14 through 20. The monarchy is something that is interesting because it's the only place in the Pentateuch where it says, when you go into the land, I'm paraphrasing, and you ask for a king like the nations, you may certainly put a king over you, and this is going to be the rules, blah, blah, blah. Well, when that happens in 1 Samuel chapter 8, and they do ask for a king like the nations, Samuel, you would think, would say, well, we knew this was coming in Deuteronomy 17, it says it, but he acts like he doesn't know anything about it. He tells God, hey, these people are asking for a king. Never heard of such a thing. You would think that'd be a great opportunity for God to tell Samuel, relax, Samuel. It's in Deuteronomy chapter 17. You didn't read that?
Yeah.
But he doesn't know about it either. This is what's shocking.
No, well, in actual fact, he refers to it as they have not rejected you, but they've rejected me, and he refers to it as wickedness.
That's right, wickedness. You read 1 Samuel chapter 8, chapter 9, 10, all the way up through chapter 15, basically, and you'll see traces of this. So this is a problem in theology, but what's interesting is 12 through 26 are totally missing in this document. Not a trace, not a trace. And if you were going to write a document, let's say I'm a forger and I'm alive in 1878, and I get I get some good scraps and I want to fake a manuscript. I go, I'm going to trick the scholars, because if I can trick the scholars, then I can trick the common folk. So the way I'm going to trick the scholars is I'm going to read Bleek, who's the greatest scholar of our time in terms of critical scholarship, and I'm going to see what he says would be in the earliest form of the document, and then you would build it accordingly. Well, guess what? The one thing you would have, if you're faking a Deuteronomy, you'd have 12 through 26, because that's the earlier part. You're not going to produce one that lacks the whole thing. The whole law code is missing. So there are elements like this that just smack you in the face where you go, if you're making a forgery, you are messing up. And I have got, and you and I together and Dave Tyler, I remember standing on a porch in the desert, making a list off the top of our heads of dozens and dozens of reasons it can't be fake. And a lot of that is because of what we now know about the Dead Sea Scrolls, which, by the way, we're going to be really talking about over the next several weeks and months, because I'm right in the middle of working for an article for Brill on the Shapira fragments.
Well, that's right.
So,
I am looking forward to that. I'm just going to, I've just noticed in my notes as well, when I was reading Bleak, here's a quote from his book. It seems highly probable to me that the original narrative consisted of the following portions: chapters 13, verse 1 to 14, verse 4, 10 to 25, and verses 39 to 45, but that the remainder, chapters, 14, 5 to 10, 26 to 38, was not added until it was afterwards revised or enlarged. So that's Bleak. However, the Moses Scroll, Numbers 14, verse 30, is derived from the Moses Scroll, which Bleak had mentioned, but there's a much larger portion, and therefore, if Shapira was using Bleak as a textbook to produce his forgery, why would he go against Bleak's highly probable conclusion of originality? But he does this on multiple occasions. Nevertheless, there was enough in Bleak's book for Shapira to be convinced that he has something highly significant and acts accordingly. All right. Now, just before we get off that, I just want to say g'day to Dave, who's in the room. Dave has shared some more excellent photos, those who are in the Yachad, of the Conrad Schick and his World Conference in February, where he and yourself and Patty, you delivering that presentation. Some good photos.
Hey, that was so fun. Let me just say, I was I don't get nervous, but at the it was a big deal for me to go. But let me tell you, Dave and Patty, Ralph and Becky, a friend of ours, we both know, Ron Vanderham, he was there. Bridget was in the audience. I mean, I had to really, I felt pressure on me that I normally wouldn't. Number one, I'm in a room full of scholars, which I don't really get enamored with people of high rank or anything like that. But y'all wanted to do a good job.
But they're all here in one room, Ross.
And especially because some of my best friends in the world were there, and it was so fun to give that talk, because above everything, I was convinced, number one, that Shapira had received a raw deal, that Moses Wilhelm Shapira not only has been maligned and mistreated and labeled as a forger since 1870s. I felt like I owed it to his name and his honor to stand up for him in that place. And of course, as I began to lay that case out, I think that the people who were there would say that we did a pretty good job, because afterwards, people were asking questions, and to this day, I'm friends with some of these scholars. I will say this: one of the guys that I met, one of the scholars, Ronnie Reich, is the person who is the expert on the city of David. And so therefore, my talk was on the Siloam inscription, which we're going to talk about next week. My research from this talk is now part of his book that will be published in this coming year, I think. And of course, it's all in Hebrew, but he's going to give credit to Shapira for what we're going to tell people next week that he brought to the table with Siloam.
Good deal. No, I'm looking forward to that. Anyway. Is there anything in the letter to Strach that we didn't touch on? Do we want to cover anything there before we wrap this up?
We haven't talked about Strach's letter. Now, that is coming. I say we're going to deal with Shapira and the Siloam inscription. At the end of next week's show, we're going to touch on Strach's letter, because that's going to lead us into... Is that fair? I mean, you see where I'm going with it?
We can absolutely do that. We can absolutely do it. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
all right.
It stays in a bank vault until around Easter of 1883. Shapira reads Bleak. What a change came over his mind, Jono. And he said, I think this thing is original. And he goes and gets it out. We're going to take just a slight detour and go back in time next week, talk about the Siloam inscription, and then we'll pick up our story as we go.
That is the show for today. But before we do go, we do have news. We mentioned how Genesis kicks off chapter 1 as an Elohist document, and from chapter 2, verse 4, it becomes a Yahwist document. And that reminded me, Ross, you've got a new book. There's a new book
do.
that's available for purchase called the Genesis Tablet. Have I got that correct?
The Genesis Torah tablet. And let me tell you quickly about those. By the end of next week, God willing, Exodus will be up on Amazon. The following week and a half, Leviticus, then Numbers, and then Deuteronomy. What I decided I want to produce, and I'm not giving a date because our schedules are busy and I don't want to mislead people, but I want to produce a commentary on the Pentateuch. And so one of the first steps in that for me was to arrange the text, and I'm using the ASV of 1901 because I like its literalness, and then I'll comment on it. But in this work, the Genesis Torah tablet is the manuscript, the ASV text in scroll format, I call it. In other words, if you pick up any volume, any edition, any version of Genesis, you're going to see random breaks and paragraphs and poetry's arranged one way and prose another way. I wanted mine to represent what you see in a Torah scroll, but in English. So a consistent square block of text all the way down, only breaking when the Hebrew text has a white space, a break in it. I indicate the annual Torah cycle readings, the triennial cycle Torah readings, and you have text on the even page, Jono, and on the odd page, on every page, you have text and a place for people to take their notes. So the idea is that the Torah tablet is a companion for students to work through the Torah readings and study and engage with the text in a real meaningful way. So that's out on Amazon right now, the Genesis Torah tablet. Link will be in the description of this video. And so we're excited about that.
Good deal.
Yep.
That's not the only new format available. Guta's book, which you published, thanks to Dave and Patty helping an enormous amount there with the translation and so on and so forth, is now available in Kindle?
It's available in Kindle, so you can get that one in paperback and Kindle. Kindle version, up until this morning, was the #1 new release in archaeological and archaeology and discoveries. #1 new release. I think it's #2 right now, unless God helped us get back in that #1 spot. There you go. And then we have one more publication. While we're talking about them, I'll go ahead and just jump in and tell you. Well, we mentioned it already. The Moses Scroll is Audible. It's currently #2 in archaeology and new discoveries as well. So
the audio book is #2 as an audio.
#2 on Amazon.
Nice.
That's right.
Good
we're
job.
very blessed.
We're
thankful, and we appreciate people buying these books. They help us do all that we do. I mean, it's part of what we do here at Horeb, and I'm excited about it. So
very encouraging. This coming Shabbat class
is going to be on Torah portion, Pentateuch portion, Mishpatim. We're in Exodus chapter 21 through 24:18. So Mishpatim, we're talking about after Horeb. What happens after Horeb? And then those classes, Jonah, the Pentateuch New Look series, is followed by a live interaction with me and many of the friends that are here with us tonight in the Yakad. And other people can join us. They can watch the video and then have a live chat with us, questions, comments.
Interaction straight afterwards.
People can join us right here in Horeb in the Discord. Or Seth has it so easy that if you don't know how to do that, you just sit there and eat whatever, drink, sit, relax, and you'll be carried automatically to view the next thing we're doing. So Saturday morning.
Oh, is that right?
10:30 a.m. Central Time. Yeah, it's automagic.
All right. And to join the Yakad, I mean, I just mentioned some of the photos that Dave's been sharing there, but to be part of that group, and we're about to head over to that group now and do a little bit of Q&A, simply click the join button there on YouTube, and it will take you there. The UI 81st conference coming up in April. Is it full yet? Can people still register to come?
They can sign up. UIWU.org, go to conference, click registration. There's no fee, but you have to register, Jono. I don't know what to prepare for you if you're not here. I need to make you a name tag so you don't feel left out. I want people to say, oh, you're Jono. And, you know, and that way you don't feel lonely and left out. And so, yeah, you have to register. I mean, what else can I do? We give you the the conference for no charge. Just come and join and be part of it.
Just let us know that you're coming.
That's right.
Link in the description. That is it from us. Don't forget to like the video and leave a comment, ask a question, or anything. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you for tuning in, and we will be back this time next week.
See you next week. Thanks, Jono. I appreciate you.